Okay, let's go ahead and get started. I think we're missing quite a few people today. Okay, so assignment 2 was due last week. I didn't get a chance to finish grading these, but I should have the grades for these done soon. Assignment number 3 is due, I'm pretty sure, tonight. Yeah. But I think most people already finished it. How many people already finished number 3? Okay, perfect. And then number 4, it works out well because it's the same thing, but for this other thing called grid. It just gives you some practice. So this is another one that you could just spend the rest of class working on. It doesn't take too long. We'll have an assignment number 5, which will bring a lot of this stuff together. And I'm thinking that'll be a good point after assignment number 5 for your midterm. So I'm thinking as of now, the best time for midterm would be the week before spring break. So spring break, it looks like, is on the 16th. Yeah. So let's say tentatively it's gonna, for this class, it's gonna be the week before spring break. That works out well because that'll give us enough time to do that assignment after, and then that assignment, that's what your midterm will be based off of. I think that's pretty much it. Nothing really, I mean, once we get going in the middle of the semester, we just have our assignments and that's pretty much it. I don't think any holidays or anything affecting us except for spring break. So any questions before we get started? Okay, so let's just very quickly review what we did last week. So we'll do an example with that, but before we start anything, so open up brackets, make a folder for today. Today's the 17th. So new folder for today. Inside of brackets, point the open folder to today's folder. Oh, sorry. Forgot to switch over here. There we go. Okay. Yeah, so again, create a folder for today. Open up brackets, point it to that folder. Create our ex1.html. So we'll start off with the HTML shell. Let's see, I want to copy. There we go. And this will be ex1.html. Let's just do a quick review of Flexbox using the most common use case, which is a site navigation. So up here, well, I guess we can type it down here first and then we'll fill in the classes later. So at the very least, well, we know we're going to need style, so we can put it there now if we want. And we're going to have a navigation, unordered list. We'll just write link 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We'll be lazy. Or no, we can actually at least. So it doesn't need to actually be like an href. Save a little bit of space, but let's pretend we're making a navigation for IRC. So home, advising, registration, maybe link to Blackboard. Workday, I guess. So this is a pretty typical site navigation. Now, obviously, and like I said before, we would do href equals, whatever, but this makes it a little bit more readable, a little bit more compact for doing examples today. So last week we talked about Flexbox being very good at one-dimensional layouts. And we have the outside container and then the items within that. Now, the Flexbox game had to actually do, well, I realize some people went all the way to the end. You can actually do some pretty interesting things regarding the ordering and stuff like that. And in practice, what I've noticed is most people actually use the simplest cases, which is just laying something out and spacing some stuff in between. Okay. So to turn on Flexbox, we have to set on the parent container the display property to flex. So in this case, nav. So if we were to set display flex on nav, it only has one child. So it wouldn't really have the effect that we wanted. So what we should do is set display flex on this unordered list, and then the individual list items going back here. So we have the container and the parent and the children, container and items. UL would actually be the container. So you might think, what is nav doing? Why do we even have that then? It's just for, it's a navigation, so we put the navigation tag. Okay, we could get rid of it, and visually we wouldn't see a difference. But again, we don't want to just use divs for everything, which we could do, but a lot of reasons that we've talked about, having to do with search engines, readability, and so forth. Okay. So let's go ahead and on the nav, let's go ahead and give it the class of primary nav. And then up here we can say for the class primary nav. But again, we don't want to set it on primary nav. We want to set it on this unordered list. I think we very briefly went over this notation. Does everyone remember this? This basically says the unordered list underneath primary nav, which is referring to this. So for that, set the display property to flex. And I guess this is a good time to preview. Little space here. Oh, yeah, so. Okay. If you remember our unordered list, there was some other things that we had to do to it. So we had to set the list style type to none. That gets rid of the bullets. And I think it has some margin here. Let's go ahead and do this. I'm going to open it up in Chrome Developer Tools. That way we can kind of clearly see what's going on with any margins and padding. Yep, and so we have a bunch of padding on the left there. So as I hover over the unordered list, you see the green. It's saying that there's a bunch of padding there. So we go back here. Let's say padding is going to be 0 pixels, or just, I think we can just do 0, but just out of habit, I do 0 pixels. Okay. So this is all jumbled together. The first thing you might want to do is spread it out so it's the full width of the page. So let's go back to the Flexbox example. So just by setting display flex, we turned it on. Now by default, it's going to flex in the row direction, which should be pretty obvious, is that we have a number of items and it's all in the same row. And by default, it just flexes left to right. You can reverse it, but we're not going to worry too much about that. And we're not going to wrap anything around because it doesn't really work well for navigation. So here's one that might be interesting. Let's start off with this, justify content. So let's do this. If we're making a site, we might want to do space around or space between. Let's start off with space around. Okay, so that's sort of resembling something kind of like a navigation. One of the things that we can do is maybe like a solid background color. So to me, that solid background color would most likely actually make sense on nav. So directly on the primary nav class. Now, we're not setting this on the UL. We're setting this directly on the primary nav. Background color. Just some sort of dark color. It doesn't really matter what. Let's try dark cyan. And then the text color, let's make it, we'll just say white. Usually they use like an off-white of some sort, but white's fine. Maybe give it some padding. Bless you. Maybe the font weight as bold with 18 pixels. Let's see how that looks. 10 pixels is probably too much. Let's say 7, 5, 4, something like that. Close enough. Now, just some minor cleanup things here. So this could be your site's navigation. What's great is that it's automatically responsive. Notice that as the device size gets smaller, so you could pretend that this, actually let's do this for real then if we're gonna pretend we have different size devices. Let's go ahead and actually use this. Okay. So we can see that it's automatically responsive. Now, just as a one quick cleanup note, does anybody remember? Notice how we've got a little bit of I'm pretty sure this is going to be margin or padding. It doesn't really matter actually because we'll just zero out both. But does anybody remember why this happens? Notice that we have a little bit of white around the edges here.
Automatic padding.
Yeah, exactly. So let's go ahead and zero out on HTML and body. Padding 0, margin 0. Okay, and I think this is pretty typical of a Flexbox. So we can probably leave this example as is. Now, if you wanted, very quickly, if you wanted the background to be the full length and then have these inside of some inside container, remember that technique is that we could make a container class that's, say, 1200 pixels, and we put the nav outside of the container, but the unordered list inside of the container, and then that would cause this to be kind of squished in a little bit. But that's kind of, I don't want to get overly complicated with this example. I want to try to keep these relatively short. Okay, so between some of these examples, like we've done, like for like navigation and the Flexbox game, does everyone feel okay with Flexbox? Now, don't get intimidated by all this advanced usage of it, because I'll tell you, in the real world, actually programming, unless you're doing something very unique, if you're doing like a very standard site, there's like 3 or 4 properties you're going to use a bunch. You're going to either do the row direction to be, flex direction to be either row or column. So that's very common to set. Justifying the content, and I think most people can look at this little diagram and see what's going on. Aligning items. And that covers a lot of it. Sometimes you'll use this flex property, like if you want things to not be evenly spaced, but it's very, very common actually just to want things very, evenly spaced. Now, don't forget some of the terminology. We had main access and cross access. So this example here for justify content, this is when it's pointing in the row direction. So what happens is if we point it in the column direction, the main axis and cross axis are going to get flipped. So it's actually going to be like flex start is actually going to be in the top of your page or of your container. Flex end is going to be the bottom of the container. Center is going to be the middle of the container, and so on. Okay, it's just flipped from being a row into the column direction, and then the terminology is flipped. We just see here it says defines the alignment along the main axis. Well, in this case, when it's row, the main axis is going this way. It's going horizontally. If we were to flip it, then the main axis would be going vertically. Okay. So we can close that. Let's move on to grid. Now, grid is when we are trying to do things in two directions. So when we're if we're worrying about rows and columns. Now, in practice, it turns out that, well, let me give you an example. So this whole thing could be considered a grid. This is actually a really good example. This is a grid with 2 rows with 3 columns, and they're all evenly spaced. Now, there's other cool things that you can do with this as well, is that you can have a grid over a single row and say, I want this column to take up 2/3 and this column to take up 1/3. Okay, so there's actually some really cool things. Or we can consider the whole thing one giant grid and say the standard column takes up 1/3 of the page, but say I want this column to span 2 column slots, so 2/3 of the page. This is going to be like your pretty standard grid. You know, hopefully you can see what's going on here. There are certain sites that do really interesting things with grid, and it almost looks like puzzle pieces fitting together. New York Times is a pretty good example. A lot of news sites I'm noticing are using it, because what happens is if you kind of fit things together like puzzle pieces, it makes it so that you can put a lot of content on the page. Notice here, one of the issues with this is that we can't necessarily put as much content on here. So, and obviously for somebody like New York Times, they want things to really fit in like puzzle pieces and put as much content on the page as possible. So we use similar terminology. We have the parent container and then the children. To enable grid, we just do display grid. And now think in your head that Flexbox was really good at describing things in one direction. You want to say, I want this to be in a row, evenly distributed. And there's actually a huge amount of overlap in grid and Flexbox in what you can accomplish. So many times you could accomplish things in grid or Flexbox, but it turns out in practice you'll notice that one will feel more natural than the other. And you can actually put Flexboxes inside of grid. So this row right here, or these six items representing 2 rows and 3 columns, these might be a grid. But what you can do is inside of each one of these individual items, you can set these up as Flexbox. And so say, oh, okay, I want Flexbox in the column direction, and then maybe use some of the, I'm already switched over to grid, but remember some of the, I can't remember the name of the property, where we can make these line up a little bit better. Like if we wanted to push to read more all the way to the bottom, we could do things like that, okay? Okay, so let's get through some of the terminology. So we've got our grid. We've got rows and columns. Now what we typically do is that we set up what are called template rows and template columns. And what happens is that as I add things in those, we're going to just work in the column direction for the most part today. I think I have a couple examples lined up with rows. But it's basically going to say, as we put things in each column, how much space is it going to take up by default? And what happens is that when we run out of spaces in our columns, it automatically wraps around to a second row. So what I mean is if I define a row with 3 columns and I have 6 items, what happens is it places item 1, item 2, item 3. It knows it's run out of columns, and then so it wraps around on the next line and starts laying them out. The size of the row or column is called the track size. So what we're currently working with, either the row or the column, that's called the track. And then so we're going to specify the track size. Some of this will make sense as we do examples, but let's do it. Let's just go ahead and dive in. Okay. So let's do file new. You know some of the terminology. We just have to say set display grid. We know that we have to set up a template, and then we'll go from there. Okay, let's copy and paste this. And I'm going to set up kind of a manufactured example just so you get some practice. And let's create a div, and that's going to be our container. So we're going to call it class equals container. And then within that, we'll have a class called item. And we'll be lazy. We'll just say A, B, C, D, E, F. So inside the head section, let's go ahead and add style. I want to give these items a little bit of styling so they're a little bit more, they're just a little easier to work with. So we'll do .item, give it some padding, say 15 pixels of padding. Give it a background color so we can see what we're working with. Something kind of light. That'll work, I guess. Set the text color to white so we have some contrast. And I think that'll be good enough for the items. Let's just see what we got here. That will work perfect. Oh, and then the other thing is so we can see the edges a little bit easier. I like to do a border radius. Uh, 8 pixels should be good. Perfect, okay. So right now we have normal document flow. These are block level tags. So they're going to take up all the way to the end of the line, even though notice that our text actually takes up very little. It takes up the entire, it's block level. It takes up essentially, you can think of it as like a row. Okay. But now let's enable grid. So we would say on container, set display to grid, and then now magically we've enabled CSS Grid. looks the exact same because we haven't done anything with it. It's like we flipped a switch to nothing. Okay, but what we have to do is once we've turned on grid, we have to say what we want it to look like. So let's start off with this. Let's just say I told you that we have to lay out templates. So what that means is let's do grid template columns. And so what we want to say is that each column is going to be 100 pixels. But then how do we know how many columns we want? What we do is we actually repeat this. We say 100, 100, 100. So it's saying that I want it to be a 3-column layout, and each of those 3 columns are going to be 100 pixels wide. See what happened? Is that it made a 3-column layout, and then, but we actually had 6 items. What happened at D? It knew it ran out because we had only defined 3 columns, right? Grid template columns. We're setting out a template for it. And then we said, okay, I want it to be 3 columns. And it said, oh, well, I've already filled those 3 columns. Let me wrap around to the next row and let's start filling those up. What do you think if I added another G? What do you think would happen? Any guesses? It would just wrap around to the next row. Let's do that just so you can see that. So if I added one more here, G, it's just going to go. It said, okay, well, you filled up another 3. Let me go wrap right back around. You'll probably notice that these are all jumbled up together. Like, because we have the rounded corners, we can kind of see where the edges are. We actually have 2 properties for that. We don't have to use things like margin. There's kind of a grid, quote unquote, way of doing things. I think margin would work, but it's just not a super great way of doing things. What we actually have is another property, and this, again, this is grid specific. You can kind of think of these as like gutters in the middle and between your rows and columns. It's grid column gap. Let's make it large so we can see it. And grid row gap, 20 pixels. Notice that these are pretty spaced out. 20 pixels is a lot. You could shrink it down, but you get the idea of what's going on here. Is that it set gutters. This is better than trying to use margins because this is specific to grid and it knows how to handle grid a little bit better. Margin was never really meant, margin was created before grid was around, so this works a lot better. And in this case, there's a shortcut that we can use. We can actually just say, if we want the column and the row to be same, we can actually just say grid gap. I guess I'll put a comment here just so we know it's the same thing. And we'll make it a little bit smaller. Let's say 10 pixels. And that's it on the row. So if you know the row and column are going to be the same, you can just use one single property, grid gap. Okay, so that's like our basic example. Any questions? Hopefully you can see how you could take these little boxes, make them larger, fill them with real content, make them put them in maybe even inside of a container. We're actually going to get into next week these things called media queries, to where we can actually make it responsive for different sizes. But hopefully you can see how that corresponds to this. Rather than just a box with a letter in it, we'd actually fill it up with real content. Okay. And like I said at the beginning of the course, this is actually like your first real time doing interesting layout stuff, like between Flexbox and Grid. Grid to me is really where you can start to do very powerful layouts, and we'll maybe get to some examples today. For the most part, in practice, most sites, it's actually just going to be like the Audubon Society site, where it's just going to be like this. It's not going to be a very complex, like puzzle pieces fitting in together. Okay, so let's start up a new example here. Let's save a little bit of time. Actually, let's do this. We can, to save us a lot of time, let's go ahead and Control A or Command A, Command C. Let's just copy and paste the whole thing in there. That way we have more time to work on the assignment rather than typing kind of boring code. So just to let you know, these actually don't have to all be the same thing. We can, say for example, make this one 250 pixels. See what happens there when we make it, is that we're saying that that column, anything that falls in that column is going to be 250 pixels wide. Now we do have a little bit better representation than pixels, because pixels aren't perfect, and you should already notice that this is like it's just kind of confined to this little corner of the screen. What if we wanted to span the full width of the browser? Maybe we could do percentages, but percentages aren't super great, because if I wanted to do 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 as a percentage, am I going to be able to get exactly 100%? No, it's going to be, because I have to do 33% or 30, it's not going to quite add up. So what we can do instead is use what are called fractional units. So what we can do here is we can do 1 FR. We'll start off just making them all even. Fractional units are like they're relative. It's not like a pixel where it's very easy to measure. There's some sort of implied base unit, and then what I'm saying is that it's going to be one base unit, and these all are going to be the same, but it's based on how large the browser is. See how this is a little bit better because this is responsive. This took up the full width of the browser. But as I resize things, it automatically resizes too. So this is cool. This gets a little bit into starting responsive design, which is designing for different widths and different browser sizes. Well, just like I showed you before with pixels, we're not stuck with just making these all the same exact same size. What I could do is, okay, I want this one to be 3 times as large as the base unit. So 1 fractional unit, 3 fractional units, 1. Now this is going to be really wide, but based on how wide our browser is. Notice that it's always going to be in proportion. Is that middle one is always going to be 3 times as large as these. Okay, so we'll keep these kind of focused, especially since we're copying and pasting. So that'll just be a fractional unit example. Let's do another Control-A, Control-C, or Command-A, Command-C. Paste it in. Save this as ex4.html. It's so common. So let's say, for example, we had all these as 1 fractional unit. What if instead of just 3, we had a very large number, like we had like 5 items or 7 items or something like that, and they're all going to be the same? What we can actually do is we can use a function. It's called repeat. And so we pass it the number of times we want to repeat something. So 3. And I want them to all be 1 fractional unit. And notice it had the correct effect. And now, if I want to add 1 more column, all I have to do is change this to 4. So hopefully you can see why that's convenient instead of having a bunch of repeated code. The general rule is that anytime you find yourself having a bunch of code repeated over and over again, usually it's like a red flag that you can adjust it to be a little bit more condensed. Okay, so these are properties related to the container. Let's see what we can do with item. So we have some interesting properties here. Grid column start and grid column end. Same thing with row start and row end. The way these work is that on an individual item, what I can do is I can say, okay, normally, based on the template, this is how they're going to be laid out. But I want this one to be different. So what you could do is just on A, insert style. Remember, this is inline style. And then the property is grid column start. And I want us to start at column 1. Actually, let's do this. Well, we'll do the full version. It's kind of long, but I think it'll fit. We'll adjust it in a second. Actually, this is perfect. This will fit. So start at column 1 and end at column 3. Not including column 3. See what happened here is now that we can do some interesting layouts. Now this is maybe a little bit overly verbose, writing this whole thing here. So there's different ways that we can shorten this and condense this a little bit. So what we can do is we can get rid of this and we can actually say, okay, grid column start at 1, and then we put a slash, and then we want it to span 2 columns. I'm sorry. It's not going to be grid column because we're not specifying the start and end. We actually shorten this just to grid column. And we're saying start at column 1 and span 2 columns. So this is a shortened version. Is that rather than saying grid column start and grid column end, we can just say grid column and then pass both values. And we just put a slash in the middle. Now we can, I actually prefer the span and say how many I want it to go. The other thing we can actually do is we don't even have to specify 1 because it's going to fall on 1 anyway. So if we wanted to put it somewhere else, we would have to, but because it's going to be on 1 anyway, what we can actually do is just say, I want it to span 2 columns. So you can see how we shortened that considerably. Is we took that from saying explicitly where it starts and where it ends. We can say, I just want it to span 2 columns. So where it normally is going to fall, have it fall that column and the next column. Now we can actually do the same thing with rows as well. Like if we wanted something to be 2 rows tall, I guess you'd say 2 rows vertically. Like if we wanted B to go from here to here, we can actually do that as well. So if we go to B, we can go to style equals and then grid dash row span 2. And see how I say kind of, I was talking about before that these kind of can fit together like puzzle pieces. So if B had a lot of content, you could force that to fit in there. And if C didn't have a lot of content or C wasn't as interesting, or A, for some reason, it just naturally lended itself to be a little bit more in the horizontal direction, just for whatever the content is. Maybe it's like several small pictures in the row. But hopefully you get the idea. Okay, so I think the best way to learn this is I think you have the basic tools. Very, very quickly, let me take a step back. I put this other site in here, Grid by Example. They have some pretty cool examples. Basically kind of what I just told you. And notice that you can actually do an entire site like this. This is very interesting like this. Like you can have header site and so on. This is really, really good for layout. You wouldn't have believed how difficult it was doing these sorts of layouts 10 and 20 years ago. The tools we had were incredibly primitive. People were trying to lay out their whole site inside of a table, and tables just really don't work that well for that. And now not only do we have something a little bit more sophisticated, we can do all kinds of interesting things like really maximize how much content is on the page based on, saying, okay, I want this to span 2 columns or 2 rows, or, you know, however you want to set it up. But this is an interesting site to check out. If you really want to get into the details a little bit more, this person was an early proponent of CSS Grid. I'm not sure if she works for any of the browser makers, or if she just is. I think she has some sort of tight association that she's considered an expert on Grid, but she has a whole bunch of videos on this as well. Some of these can get a little bit technical, like things like min-max, because obviously, you know, this person's an expert on it, so of course. But if you just want kind of these simplistic things like we did in class, these videos on here are pretty interesting as well. And they're relatively short. They're like 5 to 10 minutes, I think, in general. Okay. So any questions on the basics of Grid? Don't forget, just like with the Flexbox, you have this to go back to. So your assignment is very similar to Flexbox Froggy. This is CSS Zen Garden. And then the idea is that you've got this water and some carrots. Let's go to another level here. Let's say this is a good example. And so I've got 3 columns of carrots, and I want the water to go over those 3 columns. Well, you can see here they've already provided grid column start, so I might say, okay, well, grid column end, and oh, I can't remember, is it 3? Well, 3 means that's where it's up to, but not including 3, so what I actually need is 4, and then there we go. So just a lot of that, just to get some practice. Next week, what we'll do is take all we've learned with Flexbox, Grid, other techniques. I'll introduce something called Media Queries, which are pretty interesting. And it's just basically, it says, based on how the size of my browser, the screen resolution that I'm working with, we can flow things different ways. Because obviously in a desktop, 3 columns make sense, but you don't typically visit a 3-column layout on a phone. What do you usually visit? Single column. So we can see here that it automatically responds by collapsing it down to a single column. We can actually see that process too if we set it to responsive, and we just keep on collapsing the page. So notice how it starts off as 3 columns, and then maybe like a more shrunken version of 3 columns. Some sites do it on load. It looks like this, like whatever. Some sites you can actually do this dynamically. Pull it like this and it'll work, but this isn't working. So we'll just pretend that example never happened, but you get the idea. So we'll do that next week, but for this week, just worry about getting some practice using Grid. I'll have assignment 2 graded soon, hopefully by tomorrow. Assignment number 3 is actually very, very quick to grade, so I should be able to probably knock that out the same day. Okay, so a little bit short of a lecture, but that gives you some time to practice CSS Grid. Any questions on anything? Okay, so take a short break, about 10 minutes I'd say, and then once you get back, to spend the rest of class working on CSS Grid Garden, and then when you're done with that, you can head out, but only when you've done that and you've completed it and you feel confident and you've turned it in and everything is good, okay?